Good morning to everybody. Hi. Ni hao. Zeynep, how are you? She's in Paris. We are all over the world. I read a book. I brought a book to you today. The book is A History of Future Cities by Daniel Brook. He is a journalist, but the topic is really interesting for us. He is talking about some cities, Dubai, Mumbai, Shanghai, and St. Petersburg. They are Asian cities, but at the same way they have been designed by European people, but developed by Asian people. It's quite interesting to understand the shape of the city and try to investigate that. So we must discuss about that, which kind of tools and conceptual instrument we have to study that. As you all know, since almost 1 decade we are working together with Southeast University in Nanjing, we as Politecnico di Torino, in a joint research unit called Transitional Morphologies, and it is exactly about this topic and this kind of questions. And also we open some research programs together with other PhD candidates, and overall inside our PhD program, Architecture, History and Project here in the PhD school at Politecnico di Torino. But now we have to understand which kind of basis we can collect, which are the most important references. Of course, we have our library, we have our books, but maybe we should ask the help of somebody else. Whom can we ask an help like that?
So maybe I can try to contact Vitor Rivera. I met with him last year in Rome at ISOF conference. So he's an important member of the ISOF network, which is very important for us. I know that he's in Porto now. What do you think? I can try to contact him?
Yes, he's a good friend. And anybody else?
Well, the Italian background on urban morphology is important too. And I know that Sylvain Mafra worked with Gianfranco Caniggia for a lot of years. He actually published the book that you have there. It is in German, but I know that he's working on the English version of it. Maybe I can call him. He's in Switzerland now, and I can talk to him about this.
Yeah, I also think that the urban morphological studies in the Italian tradition are very important for us. It's a good idea.
Also, the urban form of Italian Historical Center wouldn't be the only focus of urban morphology. It could be very interesting using that practice to investigate settlements in other cultures. Maybe Attilio Petruccioli, who settled his Biblioteca Orientalis in Trani, could help us to explore this kind of cultures and to find some references in Asia. So in this way we can move towards East.
Yes, you're right, Attilio Petruccioli. He is in Trani. He is a good friend of mine and also one of my masters. And you know, some years ago he wrote a book whose title is After Amnesia. It's a wonderful link between Mediterranean culture and Asian culture. Yes, we can start from him to go towards East.
We are in China now. Here in Nanjing, there is the other side of our Transitional Morphologies Joint Research Center, directed by Professor Bao Li at Southeastern University.
Maybe now we can contact Professor Chen Fei. She wrote a curious book about the Chinese type of morphological approach to urban design. She could explain us how it's working about urban morphology on Chinese cities.
Yes, please contact Chen Fei. She is a really young and also good scholar in this moment concerning our topic in China. And please say my hello to my colleague, Professor Bao Li in Dongda.
I would like just to address that there are not only traditional studies about urban form and urban morphology. In London, for example, there is the Space Syntax Laboratory held by Tim Stoner, and I saw from his website that they are also interested in China and how the city in China will develop in the future. But overall, I realized from his lecture and conference online that there are different ways and different tools to study urban morphology that maybe we can explore and discuss with him.
Yes, it sounds perfect. Tim Stoner. I met him several times all over the world. The first time was in Nanjing, and then I met him in London, and then again in Naples, because he is going around to tell everybody about space syntax. Space syntax maybe is the last frontier of urban morphology. We have to think about that. Thanks you all, thanks to everybody. You gave us great ideas, and I think that now we have good suggestions to go ahead with our work. We have to look immediately for Vitor and for Sylvain and for Attilio and also for Chunfei and for Tim Stoner. As soon as you all will finish your interview, we can meet again here. So let's start. Enjoy your work. I will wait for you. We can go and see you later.
Today I have Vitor Oliveira with me. Vitor is a professor of urban morphology and urban planning at Lusófona University of Porto and a senior researcher at University of Porto. He is also the Secretary General of the International Seminar on Urban Form. Hi Vitor.
Hi Zena.
You witnessed and contributed substantially to the growth of urban morphology as a field of knowledge. First of all, can you give us a brief panorama of urban morphology studies around the world?
Urban morphology emerged in the turning from the 19th to the 20th century. And as other fields of knowledge, it has experienced some periods of growth and other moments of a certain quietness. Two of the most famous books in urban morphology, the studies on Anik and Venice by M.R.G. Conzen and by Saverio Muratori, were produced in moments of quietness. The period of growth that we live today started about 3 decades ago with an increasing concern on the physical form of cities, driven by major issues such as sustainability. In the beginning of this process of growth, books like The Sociology of Space by Hillier and Hansen or Fractal Cities by Mike Batty and Paul Longley were published. And if we look at those years, the mid-80s and early 90s, we can see that the debate was being mainly promoted by British and American researchers, by Italians and French. What we have now is a much more diverse context with excellent studies of urban morphology being published in every continent, including large countries such as China to small nations like Cyprus. And this geographical diversity is also matched by an organizational diversity. In fact, it includes the development of those schools of thought that are already established, like the historical geographical, the process typological, or space syntax. It includes also the activity of many notable research centers, not necessarily promoting any of these approaches, and also many individual researchers. And it is all this complexity that allow us an increasing understanding of the physical form of cities.
So you have talked about diversity. It's interesting to see the variety of urban morphology studies and tracks. In fact, in 1994, the first international organization of urban morphologists, ISUF, was founded as a place where different scholars may exchange knowledge and contribute to the field of urban morphology. And you are an important element of that. So can you talk about ISUF briefly? What is its main mission and what are the main debates, hot topics that are taking place right now?
ISUF aims at promoting the study of the physical form of cities and of the agents and processes that keep changing that form over time. It brings together researchers and practitioners from around the world, and it offers them two main stages for debate. The first is the journal Urban Morphology, that has been edited by Jeremy Whitehead for 23 years, being now edited by Peter Larkin. The second is the annual conferences. These have been taking place since 1994, and we have been in all continents except Africa. Africa is indeed our challenge for the next years. This international scope that we have with the conferences is also achieved with a kind of framework or umbrella, if you want, that is done through the role of ISUF in the promotion of regional networks in the study of urban morphology. If I think of major topics of debate today, I would highlight four hot topics. The first, deeply related with the COVID-19 pandemic, would be the challenge of going digital. We have to discuss what are the things that we have to change and what are those that we have to maintain in order to address the main challenges of our days and at the same time to maintain our identity. The second topic would be the need for a common ground, for a common language. Year after year, we attract more and more people to our conferences. We have new authors publishing in the journal Urban Morphology, which is great. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we keep talking the same language. A third topic would be the relation between morphological knowledge, and I'm thinking of, for instance, the development of a new theory or the preparation of a specific software. The translation of this morphological knowledge into action on the urban landscape. And finally, I would highlight the topic of teaching urban morphology. Why, what is the relevance, what to teach, and how to do it.
You mentioned teaching urban morphology as one of the hot topics within nowadays. I know that you devoted an important part of your life to teaching activity, and recently in 2018 you have published a book called Exactly Teaching Urban Morphology. It's declared clearly that the objective of this book is filling the gap between the main morphological theories and the way we teach them. So can you talk about what was the logic behind the structure of this book?
Urban morphology is a field of knowledge set in between more established fields like geography or architecture, history, planning. This is an opportunity, of course, but at the same time, it is a threat. It raises major challenges. Teaching is one of those. We have to make sure that we know and that we make explicit the relevance of urban morphology, we have to know where do we teach and why. What is the relevance for a student in architecture or in geography of having a course in urban morphology? What are the contents that we select to make part of this course, and what are those that we decide that we do not take on board? And how do we organize the course? What are the specific contents of each lesson? These are the questions that the book Teaching Urban Morphology tries to address. And in order to have answers that can be as rich as possible, I've tried to gather a group of notable researchers that would be a diverse group in terms of the background, in terms of the morphological approach that each one of those were promoting, the geographical context, and finally, I try to obtain diversity in terms of the generations of these researchers.
In producing a book like this, you exploit your qualities as a researcher to grasp in the best manner the teaching activity. Which is the relationship between the didactical approach you carry on in your teaching activities now at Lusophone University of Porto and your research activities and objectives, and how do you integrate these two dimensions?
I usually present myself as a researcher, a teacher, and a practitioner by this order of importance, or if you want, by the time that each of these activities takes in my professional life. I believe that the link that you mentioned is quite important, but I would extend it in order to encompass practice. I believe that the triangle between research, teaching, and practice, a triangle of mutual influence, is crucial in our field. But going back to the link that you mentioned, yes, the recent advances in urban morphology must be always informing the ways how we teach. In my case, in the beginning of each year, I revise my course in order to accommodate the things that I've learned over the last months. But the other way around is also true. The simple task of organizing knowledge to communicate it and the feedback that we get from students can offer us new perspectives and new insights that we might use on our research. And that is even more evident if we have the opportunity of teach in a different country, teach in a different continent.
And thank you for introducing the mutual influence between teaching and practice. Can you tell us more about how and which notions of urban morphology can be integrated and can be translated within the practice of architectural profession?
The relation between teaching and practice has been a theme of debate for decades. In this debate, there is always some frustration among academics because the link between knowledge and action is not straightforward. It's not easy to go from analysis to design. Yet, we should bear in mind that this teaching practice gap or research and practice gap is not new, and it's not exclusive of our field. In a recent chapter that I wrote, I had the opportunity of making a survey among some fields that are quite distant from urban morphology. These are health, education, law, and economics. And in my analysis, I've found that the debate in these fields always mentioned the gap between research and practice. In one of those, in education, this topic has been addressed since the end of the 19th century. So it's something that is shared with other fields. It's something that is difficult to achieve, but I think we have to continue to develop efforts to bridge this fundamental gap. And to conclude with a positive note, I can tell you that in my own courses of urban morphology, those short-term courses in urban morphology, and in the workshops of the Portuguese language network of urban morphology, we always have the presence of students coming from the architectural practice and the planning practice. So there is an interest in practitioners on what we are doing in research.
Thank you, Victor. See you soon.
I will be talking with Sylvain Maffra today. Professor Maffra is an art and architecture historian and lecturer at Zurich University of Applied Sciences. He's the co-founder of the international seminar Urban Form ISUF, and he is a member and editorial committee of the journal Urban Morphology. Hello, Professor.
Good morning.
I know your work has been specially focused on the Italian studies of urban morphology, typomorphological approach, the idea of type and its appliances to the study of urban forms. So can you briefly tell me about these traditions of urban morphology studies?
Chiaramente dirò che gli studi di tipomorfologia urbana hanno iniziato nel secondo dopoguerra, negli anni 50, non solo perché c'erano tante distruzioni da riparare e da ricostruire, però c'era la crisi della modernità razionalista e dunque si cercavano alternative a questo modo di pensiero. Dunque direi che c'era un tentativo di rifondazione della pratica urbanistica, dunque non in senso diciamo razionalista moderna, quest'idea che tutto deve essere fondato su principi, su assiomi, però appunto l'idea era di trovare un nuovo rapporto con la storia sedimentata nelle città e la storia anche vissuta in comune dalla popolazione. Dunque c'era quest'idea che la città è un bene comune che deve venire sviluppata in comune e non tanto seguendo metodologie astratte.
Thank you for that general introduction. I am now wondering, what were the circumstances that led to the spreading of the field of typomorphology since it started?
Negli anni 50 c'era questo bisogno di rifondazione dell'urbanistica, del risanamento delle città anche, e abbiamo questa tematica del postmodernismo. Dunque la ricerca di un superamento dei limiti del razionalismo, di questa modernità astratta. Però c'è un altro motivo che è molto legato alla situazione del dopoguerra. Abbiamo in Italia un confronto molto violento tra democrazia cristiana e partito comunista, e la città viene considerata appunto come un bene comune che si tratta di riconquistare nell'interesse della maggioranza. E allora abbiamo questo tema che si diffonderà in tutta l'Europa, a Berlino, a Bruxelles, a Parigi, anche in Svizzera, a Ginevra, a Zurigo, di consentire alla popolazione di rimanere nel centro città, dunque di resistere alla perdita di funzione, di interesse dei centri storici, dei centri densamente abitati, e appunto si cercava di risanare gli alloggi, però lasciandoli con la loro ricchezza di testimonianza storica, il loro spessore di significato storico. Dunque la morfotipologia è diventata negli anni 60-70 la metodologia del recupero dei centri storici per, diciamo, per i più.
I am aware that an English version of your book with Caniggia, The Morphological Approach to Cities and Regions, is being published now. So what changes do you think publishing it in another language other than German would bring?
La scoperta che io ho fatto dopo 35 anni di ricerca è che infatti quello che si chiama in Italia la filosofia neo-hegeliana di Croce, di Giovanni Gentile, che si chiama anche filosofia dello spirito, non capivo bene questo termine, questo concetto spirito. Infatti tradotta in tedesco significa Lebensphilosophie, filosofia della vita. E allora si è chiarito per me il legame con la fenomenologia di Husserl, quella di Heidegger, e allora sono stato in grado di capire cosa Saverio Muratori intendeva con la sua nozione di tipo, processo tipologico. In tedesco si usa un concetto che è stato messo a punto da Goethe, che si chiama Bildungstrieb, in inglese formative drive, e Saverio Muratori parla di energia di un processo. Dunque il tipo è questa energia di un processo che consente alla città di svilupparsi su se stessa, rimanendo in un certo modo identica a se stessa. Dunque c'è quest'idea dell'analogia tra la città e un organismo vivente, e la fenomenologia di Husserl è molto legata al mondo della vita, a questa Lebensphilosophie, e fornisce anche i concetti metodologici per capire appunto la continuità dei processi. Allora, il tipo, secondo Muratori, prima di tutto è l'unità di parti, di molte parti, e Husserl ci consente di capire che quando parliamo di parti di un tutto, ce ne sono che sono indipendenti e ci sono delle parti dipendenti, delle parti che non si possono staccare dal tutto. Allora, quando Muratori parla del tipo quanto sintesi a priori, vuol dire che per esempio in un edificio la struttura non può essere staccata del tutto. L'organismo distributivo non può essere staccato dal tutto, però ci vuole un ingegnere ci vuole qualcuno che studia la funzionalità della pianta, dell'edificio, però tutte queste parti che non possono essere staccate sono momenti della concezione globale dell'edificio, e lo stesso si ripete a livello della città, a livello del tessuto urbano, a livello del territorio. E questo direi è la scoperta che sono riuscito a fare.
So the concept of typology has been discussed broadly in your work. How has this concept evolved with time?
La tipologia edilizia esiste nell'ambito della metodologia razionalistica e esiste anche nella tipomorfologia di Caniggia, di Saverio, Muratori. Dunque abbiamo lo stesso concetto che viene interpretato in modi diversi dai razionalisti e dalla tipologia muratoriana. E direi che la differenza maggiore è questa, che i razionalisti cercano di costruire, di progettare usando un metodo analitico, procedono con classificazioni, analisi e cercano di fare il progetto mettendo insieme i risultati di queste analisi, di questi inventari dei bisogni, delle parti costruttivi, che sono appunto parti indipendenti, in differenza dell'idea di momenti del progetto. Dunque abbiamo questo metodo razionalistico e dall'altra parte rimaniamo fedeli a quest'idea che un progetto si sviluppa facendo schizzi. Dunque si avvicina a un progetto chiarendo quello che vuole essere, e appunto abbiamo questa idea di formative drive, Bildungstrieb, qualcosa che si sviluppa nel tempo, e non è così che uno ha le idee molto chiare all'inizio del processo, però sa quello che cerca e lo cerca sviluppando molti schizzi, e alla fine riesce ad identificare quello che doveva essere il tutto. Dunque sono due metodi totalmente differenti, l'uno che vuole essere una metodologia razionale, l'altro che è anche lui una metodologia razionale, però che procede in un modo molto più diciamo intuitivo, che cerca l'identità di variazioni. L'idea di variazione è molto presente nella filosofia di Husserl, nella fenomenologia, e si arriva alla comprensione del tipo che si cercava moltiplicando i tentativi, le varianti.
And how has the spreading of the use of urban morphology and typomorphological analysis in schools of architecture all over the world defined how cities are being studied today?
È chiaro che Gianfranco Caniggia ha sviluppato il suo metodo lavorando su città come Genova, come Firenze, come Roma, come Napoli. Saverio Muratori ha iniziato il suo insegnamento a Venezia, poi è tornato a Roma per insegnare. Dunque qualcuno potrebbe pensare che queste metodologie sono legatissime all'ambiente italiano, però appunto ognuno nel mondo può adottare questo metodo, e appunto capire che nella città c'è una dinamica storica, dunque lo spessore storico è molto importante e direi che è anche un modo di intendere la vita. I razionalisti pensano che tutto è sempre presente davanti ai nostri occhi e non sopportano l'idea che nel passato c'è anche verità da scoprire. Loro vogliono avere una città, diciamo, trasparente nel presente. E, appunto, Muratori, Caniggia cercano di sensibilizzare gli architetti, gli urbanisti, sì, la popolazione a questa profondità del territorio, questo spessore storico della città e l'idea è che la città cresce anche mettendo in luce nel presente cose dimenticate. Dunque c'è questo lavoro di andare a fare archeologia nel tempo passato per capire meglio quello che la città può diventare. Dunque si capisce le potenzialità di sviluppo della città vedendo come adesso nel presente, però vedendo anche come è stata e come potrebbe essere. In filosofia da Aristotele c'è l'idea che la forma e la potenza della materia, dunque c'è nella materia la possibilità di essere in un altro modo, dunque ci sono tantissime forme in potenza nella materia e l'analisi il progetto deve riuscire ad identificarle. Dunque c'è anche una profondità filosofica in quel metodo.
In your teaching experience in Zurich, have you seen these approaches evolve or change? And which characters or academics have defined these changes for you?
Un ricordo relazionato a Zurigo dove ho iniziato a lavorare all'inizio degli anni 80, dunque tanti anni fa, c'era a Zurigo un professore svizzero, però che ha iniziato ad insegnare a Austin in Texas negli Stati Uniti, era molto legato a Colin Rove. Colin Rove è quell'autore di Collage City che certamente conoscete. Collage City è la Bibbia del postmodernismo e dunque a Zurigo avevo nell'ufficio accanto al mio un professore che professava il postmodernismo e direi che Colin Rove è un personaggio molto colto, però un po' cinico. Pensava che anche con la città si può giocare, fare scherzi. Questo è il modo postmodernista di fare progetti, dunque c'è sempre questa dimensione del gioco, le cose non sono così serie. E infatti io stesso ho fatto una prefazione alla traduzione in francese di Collage City e penso che non è un lavoro che voglio ripudiare, però trovo più profondità, più serietà nell'approccio di Caniggia, di Muratori. E appunto quest'idea che nel progetto si può anche avere una relazione con la verità, con l'intelligibilità della città, questo mi convince di più perché nella teoria del collage tutto rimane a pezzi, mentre se si cerca l'intelligibilità della città si fa anche un lavoro che serve a tutti per appropriarsi della città, del proprio ambiente. Dunque posso dire che sono passato da una seduzione per il postmodernismo di Bernard Hösli e il suo amico Colin Rove a una convinzione sempre più forte per il contributo di Caniggia e Muratori.
Thank you very much, Professor Mafra, for taking the time to talk to me today and for being part of this project. I really hope we can see you soon.
Attilio Petruccioli is an architect, an Aga Khan professor, a full professor in Politecnico di Bari and in Qatar University. He is also the director of Biblioteca Orientalis and of the Study Center for Architecture in Islamic countries. Professor Petruccioli has published many articles and books on architectural design and architectural history of Islamic countries. In your career, Muratori and Caniggia studies on urban form have been a driving force for reading contexts that are far from Italy. Specifically, how can the concept of type, understood by the Italian type morphological school, be applied to the Mediterranean city of Islamic origin?
Well, the school of Muratori was born in Italy, and the generation of its assistants studied Italy. Como, Venice, Rome, Florence, Ostia Antica, Genoa, and the Calabria. Those of my generation have shifted their attention to the Mediterranean and the East. In honor of the true Saverio Muratori, who established a strong analogy between the way in which a culture constructs thought and it constructs architecture, he had made a planetary reading of Territorial Fabric, never published the book actually, and that highlighted the different characters of the great civilization. The Chinese and the USA, totally serial. The Mediterranean koine, totally organic, a concept later developed by one of his pupils, Alessandro Giannini. In the middle, the Indians, who tend to aggregate organic elements in a serial way.
In your book, After Amnesia, there is wide research about the aggregation of the typology in the Islamic context. I'm thinking about the urban tissue, and so my question is how the formal matrices can be deduced in the urban fabric of the Islamic city.
Our method of interpretation recognizes the typical behaviors within the urban fabric and classifies them according to subsequent experiences in urban fabrics. There are typical behaviors linked to human nature, such as reactions to the climate, that are universal, others that are specific. The odological criteria related to movement without a car, of course, also belong to the human category. Between the medieval Italian city and pre-colonial Islamic fabrics, there are many proximities. The most notable difference is the orientation of the mosque, which follows cultural criteria. It should also be said that the prevalence of courtyard fabrics in the Arab Islamic city makes interpretation more difficult than in the district of Florence, for instance, that is based on row houses. The study of the historical strata whose signs surface in the cities of the Arab and the Turkish Mediterranean allow us to discover that the number of cities of classical origin is surprisingly much larger than those attested by historians. Personally, I'm proud to have discovered that the Roman origin of Hammamet in Tunisia, through the interpretation of science and the measurement of urban models, is a Roman settlement, actually.
As suggested by the subtitle of After Amnesia, Learning from the Islamic Mediterranean Urban Fabric, what do we have to take with us after studying the urban fabrics of the Mediterranean city?
We must not forget that unlike geographers and pure historians, we interpret cities and their transformations to continue transforming them over time. There is a direct relationship between interpretation and project, almost deterministic, I would say. The principles of the project, the technological know-how, the guidelines of the project are not the product of the architect's invention, but are embedded in history. The interpretation is therefore a reconstruction of the stratification process of historical facts, or rather a sort of replanning, which involves filling some gaps of history. It follows that history and project are two moments of the same unitary process, and that in short, it is the place that designs the architecture of the city, not the creative artist. The principles and forms cannot be drawn ad libitum from history, as that is the attitude of postmodern theories, almost as if history were a supermarket, but in its entirety and as a process that is continuous. Operation that must be supported by the concept of type and identity, recurring examples of behaviors which make the interpretation rapid and the method scientifically transmissible. Out of many definitions of type, I would suggest the following. The type is that concept and that practice that combines the spirit of the time with the spirit of the place. Well, I decided in my career to shift the focus to Islamic countries, not only for my history, but also for the desire to respond to the request of those developing societies for a scientific method that could produce identity architectures, even if the requests were vague and confused and sometimes banally chauvinistic. I thought that by moving students from familiar Italian design themes to unknown and virgin places such as India, Syria, Iran, Uzbekistan, Libya, Morocco, Bosnia, Turkey, Algeria, and Egypt, they would abandon these uncertain and contradictory stylistic features copied by architectural magazines and apply themselves to the understanding of distant cultures. Obviously, most of the students today are architects working in Italy. I hope that thesis exercise served them to understand that there is a local way to thinking about the city as opposed to global models and the practices of the archistars. An altruistic way of empathic listening to the place. To conclude, all the schools of morphology in the past have hidden the problem of the architectural language under the carpet. For the future, it should be on the desk.
Your interest in the East has led you to build a place of memory, but also a bridge between cultures. The Biblioteca Orientalis, of which you are director, could be defined as an intellectual Silk Road. Can you tell us about this institution and its mission?
The library of Trani, Biblioteca Orientalis, is my legacy. During my career, I collected 12,000 books of Islamic architecture, cities, and landscape. And I decided to open to the public. It is held in the beautiful palace of the Archbishop of Trani, near the cathedral. Besides the books, there is an archive that contains cartography, that contains also cadastral plans, and all the material produced during the 50 years of my career. Besides, there is an interesting photographic archive that holds 60,000 slides. Some are particularly valuable because the monuments depicted there are disappeared. We tried also to have some research, and we organize conferences, small, very short videos with one simple, clear idea of architecture that I call gleanings. And we hope in the near future, after COVID-19, to be able to organize a big conference in presence.
Thank you, Professor, for the interesting answers and for participating in this project. See you soon.
Hello, Professor Chen Fei.
Hello, everyone.
We have read your famous book, Chinese Urban Design, the Typomorphological Approach. We are quite interested in the history of the book. When and why did you have interest in using morphology to study Chinese city?
Well, the first time I started to interest in using morphology to study Chinese cities when I did my PhD, and I discovered the identity crisis that many Chinese cities have been experiencing in the past 3 decades or more. This comes with international building style that are followed in mass production of housing, office buildings, or even culture buildings. The streets are more and more car-oriented with wide roadways and very little active frontage. This also comes with the erase of cultural heritage, historical areas. There's also a rapid development of new towns that you can discover in Chinese cities in the past decades. But at the same time, Chinese cities are benefit from its long tradition. It has distinct local types of buildings and public spaces, etc. And they have been adapted to local climate, materials and technologies for a long time, and is most suitable for the local custom and culture. So with this, one hand, the cultural identity crisis, on the other hand, the very rich tradition in China, I was thinking maybe we could find a systematic method to understand the transformation and development of traditional urban form and use that knowledge to guide our urban practice at contemporary period, so we could sustain our cultural identity. Although morphology, or the study of urban form, has been researched in China for many, many years, but the current methods are more descriptive. It's hard to going forward from the description of urban form to guide urban practice. That's why I turn into those approaches developed in the West that have systematic theory and methodology behind them. That's like the Kanzening urban morphology and the Italian school of typology, and also French school, etc. So I start to looking into those approaches and thinking how I could adapt and learn from those approaches to solve the identity crisis of Chinese cities. That's my start point.
You have published many high-quality articles in the past years that clearly show the morphological studies on Chinese cities. How do you think the state of urban form study in China?
In my opinion, the state-of-art urban form study is not only about the trace of urban form development over time, or how accurate you could describe the characteristics of different spatial types, but to understand the driving forces behind the changes and also the social impact of such changes on individuals, on communities, or the whole nation. We need to go a step forward from the analysis or understanding of urban form to design practice and planning policy making. Because that's how we could use this tool of morphology to help solve the problems that Chinese cities are facing at the moment. As I mentioned, the problems include identity crisis, the car-oriented development, or rapid development that produce low-quality spaces. And also it has very serious consequences on social relations, displacement of communities, and also we didn't pay attention to migrants who are moving from rural to urban China and who are marginalized in the urban development process. So we need to understand urban form is a representation of culture and social behaviors and activities. It's a carrier of collective memory and sense of place. Our study of urban form should not just stop to understand at the understanding of physical characteristics, but to understand all those substances that urban form represent or be able to afford. So I think the study of the state of art of the study of urban form is all about these substances that are embedded in the urban form development process. Without this, the study is meaningless.
We all know that the cultural backgrounds of China and Western countries are quite different. How can we apply Western morphological research methods to Chinese cities?
That's a really good question. We can't. We need to interpret and adapt those concepts or methods if you like to test them in China. Because they may not be applicable or the situation could be completely different. We need to understand the origin of those concepts and why they were mentioned at the first place and what kind of problems this concept or method are trying to solve in the Western context. So when you borrow a method or concept from a different context, you always have to ask whether this is applicable, what kind of changes you need to make it applicable to the local context. That's why in my book, Chinese Urban Design, a type of morphological approach, I have proposed 3 elements for Chinese cities. I didn't follow exactly what concerning urban planning, urban morphology suggests or following the Italian approach. Instead, I proposed the 7 elements for Chinese cities, which I think is most relevant. This includes the general plan, the silhouette, street network and street, public spaces, block and plot patterns, public buildings, and houses. They are arranged in a hierarchical scale. The reason I propose this 7 elements is because these 7 elements are most mentioned in urban planning in China, in the planning system in China. For example, the general plan and silhouettes are generally dealt with in the urban master plan at the city level. The street network and street and public spaces are dealt with in the district plan, or if the area is smaller, in a master plan of a particular area. The block and plot patterns and public buildings and houses mostly dealt with in the detailed control, the detailed the detailed development control plan in China. So you see these 7 elements are mostly mentioned in the planning system in China. That's why the understanding of their development could best be applied in practice, in planning policy making as well. That was my intention, to adapt the Western methodology according to what could be pragmatic in China. And also these 7 elements are slightly easier to study in China, because now we all acknowledge that the problem of historical materials that are available in China about the accurate plot and ground plan, as concept often used in the Western studies or British town, the study of British towns. In China, we don't have those accurate plans to follow, but the 7 elements have somehow separated those elements, but still put them in relation to each other, and we could slightly easier to use an historical material to study their transformation. I did an experiment of using micromorphology in Suzhou and published a paper about it. So these 7 elements, I believe, are the most relevant to Chinese cities, both in terms of materials available and also the possibility of input this information into the planning system, into policy making and design practice. So we always have to interpret and adapt Western concept rather than directly apply any method in China. At the moment, my team, me with my PhD students, are looking at how we could interpret the Western concept like livability in Chinese cities. So we've recently published some work on livable streets using Shanghai as a case study. If you're interested, you could have a look.
You devote to study morphology, and it led you to study urban form from various perspectives. Could you provide us some new perspectives on studying Chinese cities?
I think any research or study really need to solve problems, solve the real life problems. Your research need to be driven by a research problem or research questions rather than for the sake of urban forms analysis. As I said, without solving a problem, the analysis is meaningless. I'll give you a few examples that myself and my PhD student and fellow collaborators are working on. First, we're looking at why there's spaces are produced in very poor design quality in Chinese cities. For example, the buildings look alike and streets are lifeless and not walkable, and also the public spaces are either out of scale or too fixed to be adaptable to different activities. Is there something to do with the urban planning system that didn't do well in design governance? They didn't control or guide the design process that's to promote very good design. So that's one of my interests in recent years, looking at design governance issues of the Chinese planning system. I have published a few papers on that aspect. And as I said, we're also looking into the concept of livability and of how we could interpret livability or livable space in Chinese cities. Because livability is essentially about how well the built environment supports everyday activities and supports people's lives. And this overarching concept is like a bit like of sustainability, but livability is more about people. So by studying or interpret the concept of livability, we're trying to understand the relationship between built environment and the society and individual. Our recent work is on how to make street livable, because that is a big problem in Chinese cities. Streets are very car-oriented and not promote walking or even cycling. But at the same time, in recent years, the Chinese government promotes open gated community and trying to encourage the street within gated community integrate into the whole street network in the city. And that provides huge opportunities for us to really improve the environment of streets and make them livable for residents. So we recently have published some work on this aspect. Another aspect me and my team currently are looking is urban regeneration, because urban regeneration is a big issue currently in Chinese cities as the government promotes the improvement of living standard in urban villages or historical urban centers. So this comes with question how we deal with historical remains and not produce something fake. We have to understand the concept of authenticity, how we interpret them in historical development, and also how the development best supports people's lives, the social impact of our action in design and planning. In the past decades also, there's a lot of top-down actions that's enforced or applied in historical areas in regeneration. And that's caused serious social consequences. For example, the displacement, removal of social network, social capital. And also those actions, they tend to produce images that's desired by social elites or can be used in marketing or place branding activities and consumed remotely through media. And those actually ignored everyday life and what's actually happened on the ground. People using, for example, color shops, they socialize in pocket spaces on the street. If we don't observe what's happening on the ground and do a study of urban form, that how they actually support social activities and social life, we can't really produce a plan or design proposal that supports social lives. So that is an aspect that we are looking at the moment. I hope these three aspects I've just mentioned have answered your question about the new perspective on study Chinese cities.
How do you see the future of morphology study in China?
We are all aware that there's lots of progress in morphological study in China. We never lack of human power in doing that. We have a lot of researchers and students interested in morphology in the past several decades, and all the approaches that mentioned or developed in literature have been introduced in China and well received by Chinese scholars. And they use those methods and tools to analyze a lot of Chinese cities. So there's a lot of work going on that. And another evidence is the Urban Morphology Network established in China, in Nanjing, and that's a very good positive sign on the morphological study going on in China. But we all acknowledge the challenge of doing morphological study in China because we don't have enough historical maps that's showing accurate morphological information like the plot patterns and block structure, etc. So it's quite hard to really accurately trace the historical development just using Kanzanian method. However, I think the challenge also presents opportunities as we embrace the new technology, area of new technology. Nowadays, we have big data available, social media data become more and more easy to obtain, and to use in our research the point of interest data that we can use to understand the activities happen in urban form, in urban spaces. The smart city devices that are more and more used in Chinese cities could help us to understand the relationship of activities and built environment, the network of things, etc. All this new technology, I think, present opportunities for future morphological study in China. It could really help us to understand the interaction between human activities and urban form. As I mentioned, it's very important to understand how the urban forms support human activities and impact on human activities, rather than just about the characteristics of urban form. Another thing that I'm currently doing, or I'm intended to do, is to employ machine learning technology to help us really scale up morphological analysis. And using machine learning, maybe we could be able to analyze cities at a large quantity and doing compare and contrast of different areas in the city, or cities that have similar design paradigms, or cities from different parts of the world. And that was not possible before. With this new technology, maybe it's possible for us to do that. And also, I know there's a lot of research at the moment to using machine learning to process a large quantity of images of street to assess the qualities of street. So there's already works going on, and I think this all present a lot of opportunities for us, for morphologists, to study China and also other cities in the world.
I'm going to talk with Tim Stoner. Tim is an architect and urban planner who has devoted his career working, analyzing and designing human behavior pattern, leading as managing director of the company Space Syntax since 1995. With this company working globally, he can help us to understand the future perspective of urban morphology. Hello, Tim.
Hi, Rosella. How are you?
I'm good, and you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Nice to see you. Nice to be with you.
Let's start with some question about urban morphology and urban studies. Talking about urban morphology method firstly, they are applied in Europe and in Middle East as well as in China to understand how the city is growing. With Space Syntax as well, you are developing multiple projects globally. What is your approach to the contemporary city urbanization? How are you managing to embrace this challenge?
I think it's a balance between handling on the one part the needs of mobility and on the other the needs of human interaction, which generally take place when we're stationary. So the planning of the city is simultaneously and continuously a marriage between moving and stopping. And the greatest challenge globally that we find in this is how do we handle the vehicle, the motor car? How do we bring that under control in order to avoid the problems that cities have had in the last 100 years of traffic congestion, air pollution, severance between communities? And our approach is to slow the city down, to reduce the speed of vehicles first. That's the foundation. Before we do anything else as architects or urban planners, the most important thing is to slow the traffic down, because as soon as you do that, you humanize the traffic. After that, the next step is to design streets so that people can walk and cycle, take public transport and drive private vehicles all together. And the reason this is so important to mix mobility on streets is because for too long we've separated pedestrians from cars, and we have isolated the communities of cities one from each other. Our boulevards have become highways. So wherever we're working in the world, we're trying to create streets, create main streets, not create highways.
In design, you're working with the Space Syntax organization. Before you talk about street design and the concept of slow down the city. Considering your role inside this organization and the multiple projects in which it is used relating the spatial city with its functioning, how does Space Syntax work? Can you give us some principles that are guiding this approach?
Sure. Space Syntax is a science-based approach to architecture and urban planning, but its focus is on human behavior. That's what we're really interested in. How do people behave in cities? And why is it that cities, when we design them well, are such incredible machines for social and economic productivity? So our approach at Space Syntax is to study both the patterns of streets and public spaces and buildings, the physical pattern of the city, and the human pattern of the city, the movement, the interaction, the productivity of cities. And by putting the two together, the physical form and the social performance, we've discovered that there are ways in which you can predict how the layout of space, the layout of land uses, the location of transport, nodes, bus stops, tram stops, rail stations, how these can predictably influence the patterns of mobility, how the layout of a public space can influence whether people will choose to stop and stand and sit and spend time in it, or whether they won't. And that allows us to review, measure the performance of one design proposal against another. So our practice is simultaneously a research practice, it's a design practice, and we bring research into the process of design in a way which is typically very uncommon in contemporary architectural and urban planning practice. We find it, of course, in universities, deep research, but we tend not to find it in practice. And what we've tried to do at Space Syntax is create a seamless continuity between the deep research of academic practitioners and the active design and planning of professional practitioners. And that means that the knowledge can flow in two directions. The knowledge of research flows towards practice, and then the knowledge and the questions of practice flow back into research. It's a very rich dialogue between the two.
In having this continuity between research and practice, you talk about how to study urban pattern in the city and its physical forms. That leads Space Syntax to use a model of reality. In this sense, how modelization helped to test different strategies for the future development of the city?
So Space Syntax is very much based around the use of models. We use many different kinds of models, spatial models and models of mobility, health models, models of land value. What we try to do is integrate them. We've recently produced an integrated urban model of the United Kingdom, and of course our next ambition is to grow that model until eventually it should be a planetary model. And let me try and explain what the model has in it and what it does. The model is founded on the spatial network of towns and cities. Space Syntax has discovered that the pattern of space in a city, the street connections, the interconnectivity of streets, is a very strong predictor of movement. Most movement happens on the most connected streets, least on the least connected streets. And if you have a a model of a city with an algorithm that can measure connectivity, then we've discovered that you can predict movement. But more than that, as you look at other phenomena in the city, the pattern of land value, the pattern of crime, the pattern of social interactions, we've discovered that properties of the spatial connectivity of the city also become predictors of those other social, economic and environmental performance measures. So on top of the foundation of the spatial connectivity pattern, we add other data sets. So we might have data, for example, on health, how healthy people are. And we can ask questions, are people more healthy in this part of the city or that part of the city? Is there a relationship between being spatially connected and walking more? And there is. And so our clients in the early days of our work were architects, property developers, but today they are health authorities, investment bodies, people interested in how to service the city, how to deliver a letter, how to deliver a parcel. We're finding a lot of interest in space as people understand that the cities that we've been creating in the last 100 years are very difficult to manage and very costly to run. They're cities where if there's a problem with the traffic, it affects a wide area of the city because everything has been built around highways. The traditional city was much more interconnected, many more strong connections, so that if one connection was broken, the rest of the city could adapt around it. And that means that we're helping, if you like, in the future to go back to the past. We're helping to design cities of the future that build on the traditional city of interconnected streets that we had up until the beginning of the 20th century when we became obsessed with the car. So our models are being used by decision takers, not only architects like myself to judge one design from another, but mayors of cities who are judging a plan for the entire city in terms of not just its impact on movement, but its impact on the health of citizens, the physical health and the mental health. You know, one of the big issues we're looking at the moment is loneliness, how people isolated in spatially disconnected parts of cities who don't have access to a car, don't have a walking network, are lonely. And that's a very costly effect in cities that we can avoid through redesign.
You talk about continuity and prediction. From this, there is a character of temporality in this approach on the city as much as there is in when we try to understand the change from the past to the present in urban morphology analysis. Taking into consideration how space syntax is looking at the city as a transaction machine, defined in your conference in Hong Kong, do you think there can be a connection between urban morphology and space syntax relating time, space together?
Yeah, I think so. You know, one of the things that my colleagues at work hear me say most often is urbanization is a long game. It's a long game. The projects that we are involved in take years, if not decades, to create. And many of them never happen, or they never happen in the way that you originally designed them. I think urbanism is in some ways different to the architecture of buildings because when buildings are built, they look pretty similar to the drawings that were made of them, sometimes identical. When cities are built, they take time and they look somewhat different to any drawing that was ever made of them because things happen. Decision makers change. Styles change, materials change. And I think the architect has to adjust their mindset to appreciate time as well as space. And the challenge in all of this, I think the biggest challenge is to design what really matters in an urban plan, in the knowledge that many things will change. What is it that really must be fixed? In our experience, we have realized the most important thing to fix in a plan is the foreground grid of streets, the main streets of the plan. Those are the streets that will be there for decades, centuries, millennia. And when they are built, they're very expensive to change. If you get them wrong, you've committed a lot of cost and value to the future. They're the streets where the main services, the power, the water, the waste, are going to be channeled, so they have a very major responsibility. And they're the streets where the mobility, the life of the city will be lived. And that's the most important thing. So when thinking about time and thinking about change and thinking about how what we draw today will not be entirely built, the thing that we advise our clients and our colleagues to focus on is the main street network. Get that right and you've set the right path, literally, for the future. Get it wrong and you've fossilized the design forever. The secondary street network, the tertiary street network, you can also plan, but property changes, attitudes to mobility change. Do we allow vehicles to move through a local area, or do we remove vehicle movement and pedestrianize? Those matters change. And the secondary and tertiary street network have a much less fundamental influence on the overall performance. So focus on the primary network, and in doing that, set expectations for the buildings that will be on the primary network. Those should be the main commercial buildings, the main retail buildings, the main physical manifestations of the city should be on the main street network, the principal buildings, the signature buildings. And that's why we think it's so important to focus there in the planning process, and then let the history of the future take care of the detail.
You say that urbanization is a long game. So, taking your word from the Conference of Hong Kong, improve, intensify, and extend, do you think that this approach can have a perspective on our view on transition inside the city? Can this method be used in understanding the form of the city change from the past to nowadays?
Yeah, when we first started using this expression, improve, intensify, extend, it was for a competition entry that we made for the capital city of Kazakhstan. It was called Astana then, it's now called Nur-Sultan. And we made that in response to the brief, which was about growth. The brief was calling for a master plan to grow the city. And knowing a little bit about the city, having visited before, our view was that this city actually needed to fix some of its problems first, and that led us to the idea of improve. And the process of improving we knew would not just be about changing the physical appearance, upgrading the lighting, making something better that already existed, but also of infilling, of adding within the city schools, office buildings, cycle lanes, public transport, methods to alleviate the risk of flooding on the river. And that led us to the idea of intensify and then grow. And actually, in the end, we have delivered the plan for Nur-Sultan. We won the competition, we've delivered the plan. And in that, growth is for the future. The plan is only about improve and intensify. And that's because we found that when we challenged ourselves, challenged our client to think about improvements and intensifications, we discovered many all across the existing city. And by avoiding growth, we avoid moving into the natural environment around the city. We protect the farmland, we protect the tree line, and we give the city the opportunity to improve and intensify within itself before then, in the future, maybe 20, 30, 40 years from now, eventually needing to grow. And by taking this approach, what I think we discovered is something that could be applied to many other projects, not just by ourselves, but by all architects and urban planners, which is to question the brief, ask the client whether they really do need to grow or whether actually they need to fix what they already have. And I think there is a weakness in many architects where they think they have to produce something new in somewhere new. Actually, the real job is to go into our cities and make what's already there better. Doesn't necessarily mean demolishing anything, especially when there's so much embodied energy in the buildings that we otherwise demolish. And that requires, I think, a combination of vision and humility on the part of the architect and urban planner, which we haven't seen enough of in recent decades.
In the end, I would like to ask you one more question, maybe more traditional, about how much the form of the city is important considering design and city shape.
The shape of the city is utterly fundamental to the way that human life, social, economic, and the environmental impact of life is played out. The form in plan of streets and public spaces, we know, has on its own a fundamental impact on movement on foot, on bike, in vehicles. That movement is modified by the location of the different land uses of the city, where the shops are, where the offices are, where the houses are, where the schools are. And it's modified by the density of the city, so the height of the buildings. If you combine those three things, the density, the mix of uses, and the configuration of the street network, you've got, if you like, the DNA of the way the city works. If you just have the street network, you're part of the way there, you're an important part. But it's the richness in three dimensions of the physical city and spatial city which is closest to the realities that we then encounter. Of course, we need to overlay the aesthetic of the city. Is it beautiful? Is it nice to look at? But you know, for me, that comes out of this process of getting everything in the right place. That is itself beautiful. And it comes later in terms of the way buildings are dressed as aesthetic objects. That's a concern, but it's a later concern. For many architects and planners, it's where they start. It's where we get to in the process that we take. And ignore the height, the density, the depth of buildings, ignore the location of land uses and the way they mix. Focus only on the individual building or the look, and you're missing so much, almost everything of what actually is important in a city.
Thank you, Tim. I hope to see you in Turin soon.
It's my pleasure.
It's a good job, a really good job. You collected really interesting materials to go ahead in our work, in our studying on transitional urban morphologies and in urban morphology as well. It was a quite interesting program. It was also a great tour around the world. We went in Portugal to meet Vitor. We went in Switzerland to meet Sylvain. We went in Trani, and there we met also Attilio. And then we were in China to meet Chenfei and Baoli, and we were in London to meet Tim Stoner. So now we collected a lot of interviews, as you have seen, as you have watched. This is our background. Since now on, we can start our reflections, our reasoning, and go ahead in our studying. I want to say all my thanks to Martina, to Zeynep, to Jan, and to Tim, to Anna, and to Rossella for the great job you have done for today and for this presentation. Thanks again. But you know, I'm not totally satisfied. I think that we cannot stop here. We must go ahead, starting with a critical point of view about what we have done until now. This is something that together with Michela Barosio and Nicola Marzotto, they are the tutor of our course and of our program of research, we have to think about. And so there will be next step. For the moment, enjoy your study and good luck for your future.
Hi, Nicola. The excellent scars about the form of contemporary urban settlements in Europe and in Asia has just ended, and I'm wondering about the future perspectives for urban morphology studies. What role do you think morphological studies can play in urban design processing nowadays?
Dear Michela, to answer, we have to consider that at least since its disciplinary inception, urban morphology was following up the design practice reaction to dramatic events, which were far exceeding human being control. In that respect, after World War II reconstruction phase, we can roughly list 3 different phases. Sylvain Marfan was undoubtedly confirming in his own interview. After the progressive industrial relocation of the 1970s, the great season of urban project opened up, granting a very fertile moment of investigation on the bourgeois city and its principle. Here, urban planning still plays a role. This season, as Marfan recalls, is also characterized by a great attention to context and a deep concern for the loss of importance of the historical city, still recognized as a paradigmatic presence in our urban environment. During the period 2000-2010, we have been witnessing the season of excesses prompted by the creative finance due to globalization processes. They have put the traditional city morphology into a condition of irreversible crisis, but have opened up our attention to hybrid spatial infrastructure, pushing as well urban sprawl. Here, urban planning is largely replaced by impressive urban networks. In this case, not by chance, Marfan talks about the loss of the city and the consequent self-referentiality of architecture, mostly interested to sustainability and construction concern. From 2010 up to today, due to the financial crisis, we have been witnessing an increasing availability of disused areas, requiring involvement of other subjects than the conventional ones. Top-down processes are therefore replaced by bottom-up ones. There is a return of interest in urban morphology. Not by chance, Tonal quotes a preference for urban fixing rather than the construction of new areas and urban growth. To conclude, I do think we should not underestimate the fact this condition was, and still is, justified by ICT improvement and COVID-19 effects.
Yeah, Nicola, the framework that you have just made up is really, really powerful and interesting, and it clarifies many phenomena. I'm now really interested in understanding if nowadays it's still possible or not to design part of the city. I mean, as we were used to do, for instance, in the Baroque age. You know that I belong to Torino, and Torino is a city that have been really designed by a few important architects during the Baroque age, and this design was a top-down action. You mentioned Tim Stoners, and in his interview, he has pointed out how, from his point of view, urban patterns are much more related to human behaviors than to a single willingness of urban form. So in this perspective, the way Tim Stoners see urban design processes is more a bottom-up process. So the final urban morphology result is not an idea of form that has been designed at once by someone, but it's more the outcome of a process and not a deliberated design action. So if I look both at the historical city and also if I'm looking to the industrial city, which was a very important development period for my town, then I can only partially agree with Tim Stoner's. Of course, I think that urban behaviors have a great impact on some element of urban patterns. I'm thinking specifically to paths and street networks as well as commercial settlements. But other elements, I cannot consider them such as defined by urban behaviors. I'm thinking about visual perspective, and we also are used to some architectural features that are repeated into the urban morphologies. So all these elements cannot come from a bottom-up approach. So I think that Tim Stoner's pointed out some very important process, but this is not the only way in which society and space are dealing. I think that the relationship between space and society is more a two-way relationship, and in this sense we should inquire more specifically how they interact and how it is possible to deal with society through urban morphological studies.
I do agree with you. In that respect, I consider relevant the alternation of phases introduced by Saverio Muratori and his school, which still has a consolidated academic tradition with regard to the ongoing swinging between explorative and planned phases. However, today, with the multiplication of actors, the picture is more fragmented, if not exploded. Therefore, it is not possible anymore to mention a unique picture, but multiple ones. In addition, we have to consider the increase of transformation speed compared to the ancient time, which has accelerated the alternation of phases itself. The space syntax is reflecting on the possibility of predicting behaviors through the control of the city, working on the street pattern, density and functional mix. I argue this theme is now more dynamic than ever, but its premises are already present in the form of the historical city. In fact, we have just to think about the strict link between civitas and urbs in the Roman tradition, not to mention the identification between citizenship and the city in the concept of the Greek city-state polis. To conclude, nowadays, due to the relevant emergence of regeneration processes, the bottom-up approach is even more relevant. In that respect, we should also reconsider the agency theme. Geographer belonging to M.R.G. Conzen and Jeremy White-Ten perspective, as Cheng Fei specifically mentioned.
I totally agree, Nicola, but staying on our old continents, I think that the link that you have mentioned between civitas and urbs is specifically interesting because it is strictly connected with the idea of identity. And I think that urban morphology, of course, contributes to the identity of the inhabitants. And so thinking about the industrial identity of many of our European cities, such as Torino, I think that this is a topic we have to keep in mind. In my studies, I often try to define the specificity of industrial cities morphology, because even if the productive activities are gone, the form of the industrial settlement is still an important element for the identity of citizens. And therefore, I think that the industrial character of urban morphology should be preserved in the regeneration process of the industrial dismantled areas. You know that in Europe, main of the transformation are not new settlements, but they are regeneration processes. So I think that in this frame, the contribution that urban morphology studies can offer to contemporary urban regeneration operations is to help avoiding considering dismantled industrial areas just as gray areas with no identity, you know, just some areas to be demolished and then to be rebuilt, completely forgetting the memories connected to these areas. But on the other side, urban morphology awareness, I can say, can also help in these regeneration processes not to considering the existing building just as museums, just as ruins to be kept as they are without understanding their role in the urban identity and in the human identity as a whole. So I think that urban morphology studies can give a great contribution linked to this phenomenon of regeneration that characterizes most of the transformation process in Europe.
I do consider your distinction very relevant. We are not anymore dealing with the city growth, but mostly with its rewriting and remastering. However, your observation brings to the fore an important issue, the translation of urban morphology into the instruments of governance of the territory and the city. In the modern society, we have been witnessing the prevalence of planning over architecture. In that respect, urban morphology was, and still is, the reaction of architecture to the overwhelming power of planning, to achieve an expected reconsideration. In that respect, due to regeneration processes, nowadays architecture is regaining power as well as urban morphology. In that perspective, I'm interested in Chen Fei's position regarding the 7 morphological classes, all of them derived from the planning tools and not vice versa. Regarding the interpretation of design as a new norm writing, Italy is becoming an European leader with the new Emilia-Romagna law on territorial governance, where planning for the first time in our history is subject to the development of specific urban design proposal. However, among the new perspectives in urban morphology, we cannot under-evaluate the increasing interest for modeling, as we can see in the space syntax domain, BIM blockchain technique, application to process mapping, and last but not least, learning machine procedure, as Chen Fei was mentioning in her own interview.
Yes, Nicola, this is really a promising perspective for urban morphology studies. I think their potential in design practice that Chen Fei mentioned in her interview. So I think that for a long time, urban morphology has been perceived as just as a speculative issues developed inside academic boundaries, and the morphological studies were mainly perceived as analytical and theoretical studies. But I think that I really strongly believe that the morphological approach can be strategic for many professional practices, if only we will be able, as scholars of course, to teach this approach in an operative way. We should, as researchers, transfer morphological approaches to professional work through more operational outcomes, such as guidelines, urban codes, or any kind of outcome that can be used directly as a tool from professional practitioners. So thank you really very much for this nice talk, which is, I think, the best conclusion for this excellent course.
Thank you, Michela. Just to add a few lines to your concern, I fully agree on the necessity of re-establishing the relation between urban morphology and the practice. In addition to that, I do think we should not underestimate the increasing importance of new technologies and new devices as being blockchain technique more than model makers that would eventually facilitate our work, not, of course, superseding the necessity of our concern and body of knowledge, but to support it in order to make it more effective, more powerful, and more aligned with your expectation. I fully support. So a stronger relation between urban morphology and our beloved practice. Thank you very much again, Michela.
Thank you, Nicola.